Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 11, Individuals and Families of Asian Descent. Your chapter starts out with a little bit of historical information to inform you about the immigration patterns that brought large numbers of people from China and other Asian countries to the United States. We then move into more contemporary issues faced by this population, and so among these that I wanted to really highlight is the model minority myth. And our text goes into detail about where this actually came about, and it's been traced back to a 1966 New York Times magazine article, and the article was titled Success Story, Japanese American Style. And so this article and several that have followed it really portray Asian Americans as a quote unquote model minority with the idea that they've overcome their minority status. And so the rationalization for why this group, according to this type of media coverage, has overcome their minority status has been higher academic achievement rates, high family incomes, and relatively low mental health utilization rates. What these types of assumptions don't assume is that maybe there are cultural factors that are barriers for people from Asian American descents to seeking mental health care. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't challenges in mental health. It just means that maybe it's more difficult for this group to access the mental health system. But issues like that weren't considered when these articles first started coming out in the 1960s. And even more concerning is that many people have since hypothesized that this presentation of Asian Americans as a quote unquote model minority was also meant politically to present them against other civil rights movements of the time. So it was kind of to counter other portrayals of minority groups and add to a general problem among civil rights at that time. So this is an issue that the quote-unquote model minority myth is one that you'll see throughout this chapter, and one that hopefully you'll become a better consumer of media so that you can also notice it when you see portrayals that are inaccurate or homogenous stereotypes of a group of people that we know are actually very diverse. Our chapter also defines exactly how diverse they are. So within the Asian American group that we're studying, there's actually 43 distinct Asian groups, and these come from 20 different countries. So we're summarizing one cultural group of people, but we know that in actuality there's much more diversity within this group than even compared to other groups. Our chapter also goes through a number of different characteristics, including family, gender roles, interpersonal relationships, marriage, and it explains how these different facets of life might be different and might be similar for Asian Americans compared to other minority groups. Family is a specific emphasis just because there's a large definition of family and kinship for Asian Americans, and usually this spans beyond just one household. It definitely also incorporates many generations in many cases. So this is a collectivistic approach to life, and many times decision making is handled not at an individual level but at more of a family level. And this could range from decisions about job promotions to decisions about child rearing, all the way to marriage and a potential spouse for an individual in the family. We also take a look at interpersonal relationships, and I want you to think about these in terms of how they might influence the human services or the counseling relationship. So many times there's a preference for non-directive or non-confrontational approaches to interpersonal relationships. So confrontation for many Asian Americans can be very challenging and something that they want to avoid. So some counseling styles incorporate this approach or this emphasis on the need to really confront and counter challenges in our life, and this may not be the best fit for some Asian American clients. So this is why it is important to learn about cultural differences, and then the best thing to do, of course, as we've talked about before, is to take them to the individual and talk about whether or not they fit. So it's important to have that dialogue rather than to just make assumptions about a whole group of people. The chapter also goes on to talk a little bit more about ethnicity and race, especially since this group particularly incorporates such a large number of individuals from various backgrounds that may or may not share the same or identify with the same ethnicity or race. So our chapter talks a bit about how ethnic identification begins at a very young age, and that family also often leads that socialization pattern. But there are also a number of negative effects that may actually be challenging this community that are masked by a few things. So to go into detail about that, we talked about the first one already. So the minority myth, the model minority myth, may be masking some of the challenges of this population. Another challenge is that in the United States, unfortunately, we still sometimes tend to think of diversity or racial diversity as dichotomized between black and white issues. And so that leaves this population and others that we study completely out of consideration. And so that's another challenge in terms of there's not enough research done on this group and there's not enough inclusion in the dialogue of diversity to really know what challenges Asian Americans are facing. In addition, there's been slightly greater awareness of discrimination within this group since 9/11, and that crosses over from the group that we just studied in the previous chapter about individuals from Arab descent. So that is an improvement, but still a challenge in terms of a lacking of true diversity, even in our dialogue around multicultural competence. Related to mental health issues, there are also, as I mentioned, significant limits upon studies specific to Asian American groups, and we also have racism that's still perpetuated among this group, whether it be in explicit forms or, as we talked about in previous chapters, more passive forms that are a little bit harder to detect, but nonetheless have serious consequences. So one perceived discrimination that is observed is this underutilization of the mental and the physical healthcare services. And so, as I talked about before, this previously has been mistakenly assumed to mean that this population doesn't need these services. When we look a little bit further, we realize that maybe they're not accessible or they don't work well in terms of our general counseling or mental health services system doesn't work well with this population. So hopefully by developing your multicultural competence, you would be one of the many professionals that changes this. So to give you a few numbers to wrap your head around as we wrap up this chapter, utilization rates in terms of how often Asian Americans are using mental health services are actually 3 times less than that of white counterparts. And it does change a little bit if the individual who's Asian American was born in the U.S., then they are more likely to see a mental health provider. But another challenge to this group is that when Asian Americans do seek help, they have high rates of early termination. So that means that even though they enter counseling, they often leave on their own, basically don't come back to future appointments. So that again is a red flag telling us that there may be a mismatch and that there needs to be greater education in how can we work with individuals of Asian descent more effectively in a human services relationship that works for both parties. And just one of the challenges that might be at play in these relationships is that within the Asian American culture and within the Asian culture, there's a strong belief that the mind and body are seen as inseparable. So some more Eurocentric approaches to counseling believe that the mind is this separate entity and really is only the focus of counseling services, for example. But Asian culture would emphasize a more holistic approach. And so it's these types of conversations that we can have, even when there's a conflict between value systems, that may make services more accessible and more likely to be used by Asian Americans. Our chapter concludes with a number of guidelines for counseling clients of Asian descent, and we know that it's most important to take guidelines like these to the individual to be informed about them, but to also ask an individual how and when their culture is at play in their own personal goals and also what they seek out of the counseling relationship. And finally, our last piece talks about the responsibility that counselors should have in working with and on the behalf of Asian American clients. So among these, at the very top of the list, again, is challenging that minority myth, looking at the multiple sides of that, and just being aware of the social and personal costs of both myths like this and also direct and indirect forms of oppression and discrimination experienced by this group.